Hi folks, this is Richard James the Socio. I'm on my 2025 tour. I call it the JFK Assassination Tour of Truth. And if you know my work and my videos and my books, you know I believe I accuse Nelson Rockefeller, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, of assassinating JFK, RFK, ordered Watergate, and the attempted assassination of Gerald Ford. I should say the first attempted assassination of Gerald Ford, maybe the second one, which came like 1 or 2 days later. But I'm here, obviously you can see, obviously I'm here in front of the Kennedy compound. And I do want to talk a little bit about the overarching reasons, the obviously overarching reasons why the Rockefellers have come to kill the Kennedys. But I want to talk a little bit about the Kennedy compound. As you can see, I'm a little off-centered for a reason. I want to show you. Now, this was the home. This was the original Kennedy home. They came here. The family came here. Joseph Kennedy and Rose Kennedy came here in 1926, which was a smaller place. Then they added on to it. It's a triple gable now. And there's 3 Kennedy homes here. There's other buildings. I think there's a swimming pool and garage and thing, but the 3 Kennedy homes here, say 1963, were, you know, very much ensconced in this area. So I'll give you a little history of these buildings and tell you what their status is now. You just hear the ocean crashing behind me. It's not the best day for video, but I'm here. But I want to show you, the reason I'm a little off-centered is, I'm going to tell you why. Hopefully this works. Hopefully this works. Just bear with me a little bit. There it is. Oh. Right there. Okay, so you can see the perspective there. There's the original family home to the left. And if you go forward, you zoom in a little bit. All right, there it is. That's the home of, that was the home of John Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline Kennedy, Bouvier Kennedy. Sorry. This is kind of a low budget operation. That was their home. That home there with the white chimney, that was the home of John Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy when John Kennedy became Massachusetts Senator Kennedy. They lived there with their children. Now, the home now is, I'll say, pretty much the property of Edward Kennedy Jr., who was a former senator from Connecticut, and his I believe his brother had an office too somewhere, but I can't remember it now. But I believe he lives there now. And what happened when Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy died, the home went to her daughter Carolyn. And then Ted Kennedy bought it. Senator Ted Kennedy bought it. And now his son is residing. Ted Kennedy Jr. is residing there. I believe Ted is the junior, is the older of the 2 brothers. Now, the iconic family home is no longer, any Kennedys live there. It's owned by, it was willed to the Edward Kennedy Foundation for Government Studies, something like that, and it's run out of Harvard University. You can also see, I'm going to position the camera later, I got to move the camera, but you can just see a little bit of what was. Probably not even worth moving it, but You know, I can see it, but I don't think you'd make it out. But you can see just a little corner of what was the home of Robert Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy died within less than a year ago. Apparently, she was pretty out and about up into COVID 2019. She was known to ride around on her golf cart and check out the horticulture. It's a beautiful horticulture out here. I guess she was very conversant with people, friendly. But there was a joke going around town, a running joke, and don't stand in front of the golf cart when you're talking to Ethel Kennedy, because she how do I say it, goes without giving warning. Anyways, ha 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 ha. What? But anyways, okay, I'm going to show you. The trouble is, if you get closer to Robert Kennedy's house, the bank gets higher and you can't see it. It's hard to see. But it's not what you're thinking of. It's not that other stuff in the background. No, it's so close. It's just, you see a slim of it. I see it clearly, but you wouldn't see it. And then I'm going to show you the Shriver house. I'm going to tell you some history there. Ties to the day JFK died. And that had nothing to do with his, probably nothing to do with his assassination, but it is a chapter in American history which too few people know about. We'll talk about that. But I love talking about why the Rockefellers killed the Kennedy, standing in front of, you know, coming face to face with this history here. Basically, it was all about the Kennedys. Two dynasties came to blows. You know, the Rockefeller dynasty and the Kennedy dynasty. The Rockefeller dynasty, maybe more of a financial, industrial dynasty. The Kennedy dynasty, more of a political dynasty, and a dynasty that was showing potential to become a Tammany Hall in Washington. And when Kennedy was elected, he did so. He got the support of the House, full support of Rockefeller. I'm going to give you the overarching reasons why the Rockefellers killed Kennedy. Because the Kennedys were going to destroy the Rockefeller dynasty and put themselves as complete commander of industry, banking, everything. And the Rockefellers knew this, so they acted. That's why these people were successful, because they're not going to surrender to anybody. Don't ever think they were ever rehabilitated in 1911. Don't ever think the Supreme Court changed them in one way. They don't change their character. They just change the way they operate. So they go from secrecy to more secrecy. Okay, here's the big connecting dots and overarching things. What happened in 1960? Governor Nelson Rockefeller, okay, 1958, got elected governor of New York State. Now, this was huge. This was a massive sea change in the course of American history. Why? Because the Rockefellers, if you go back to the first generation, they were what? The robber barons. You know, the ruthless robber barons. Now, barely 40 years later, now they're getting elected to high office and shooting for higher office. If anybody knows anything about Nelson Rockefeller, they know he had a driving ambition to be called Mr. President, and he came awfully close. I'm going to show you how all the dots cannot connect up. So in 1960, Nelson Rockefeller ran 2 years after getting elected. He ran for the Republican primary, but he dropped out early, and I believe he dropped out to put total support behind JFK. First of all, they were business partners. The Rockefellers and Kennedys were at least business partners in the RKO movie theater, which they co-founded. You know, Joe Kennedy was one time a significant movie producer, as well were the Rockefellers. And after all, where's the capital of motion picture today? It's really Rockefeller Center, because all these it's multimedia now. Comcast building, you know, studios own broadcast own studios and everything else. You know what I'm talking about. Our NBC, CBS, and all the, you know, like NBC owns Universal, and Time Warner was headquartered there for years. They moved up the street though recently. The Paramount is, you know, almost called part of Rockefeller. It's in the One Astor Place on It's just off of Times Square, you know. So how Rockefeller Center is not only Radio City Center, it's multimedia center. So when I tell you these things, it's not some crazy theory. All right, now, so JFK, I should say Nelson Rockefeller dropped out to support the Kennedys. He threw the whole house of Rockefeller behind JFK's election. Now, also, the Kennedys and the Rockefellers had a very similar platform in that both, I'll just put it, were progressive. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now. And when JFK got elected, it was almost, the two guys, Rockefeller and Kennedy, skipped into the White House together. That's how charming that victory was to the Rockefellers. But things quickly changed to a point of warfare. And what had happened was, in 62, Governor Rockefeller, ran for and got reelected for governor for a second term, one of 4 terms. This was this was the family who went from the robber barons, ruthless robber barons, now winning high office. So what happened in 62? Kennedy confided in his confidants that he believed Nelson Rockefeller was going to be his top competition to getting reelected. I should say the most significant challenge to his reelection. What had happened in 62, also Nelson Rockefeller got caught taking money out of the Rockefeller Foundation to run his political campaigns. And President Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, was investigating, and they were taking action against Nelson Rockefeller. It's a huge history most people don't know about. Now we got the nexus for murder. And, the Rockefellers beat the Kennedys to the punch. Well, they're ruthless, aren't they? They didn't call them ruthless for no reason. In 64, what happened in 64? I'm giving you overarching motives here. What happened in 64? Nelson Rockefeller was the front-running Republican candidate for the 64 election right up until like the second or third night of the Republican primary. Okay, is this some kind of crazy conspiracy theory? And here's another kicker. November 9th of 1963, what happened? Well, you wouldn't know, but I'm going to tell you. Governor Nelson Rockefeller announced his candidacy for the White House 13 days before Kennedy was assassinated. So that should have made him a person of obvious motive to kill the Kennedys or to kill JFK. Because you would say, who would be the people with the obvious motive? Well, Lyndon Johnson, and who else? Jimmy Hoffa. Okay, yeah, all right, I'll give you that one. And who else? Nelson Rockefeller. If Kennedy had not died, he would have been, it would look like he would have been squared off with Nelson Rockefeller. Okay, very close. Barry Goldwater grabbed the prize from Nelson Rockefeller. And, Barry Goldwater represented the right wing of the Republican Party, which Nelson Rockefeller is way too progressive for that group. Now, these are the overarching motives here. Now, what happened in 68? Bobby was seeking the Democratic nomination, and he would have won that slam down, and a high probability of becoming president, because that was an open year, no incumbent. Unless you wanted to consider a former vice president being an incumbent. And actually, if you read my book, I got a new book coming out. I believe the plot to kill JFK started with a plot to kill Richard Nixon, but that's a long story. I don't want to get into that now. But it ties in what I'm going to tell you. So who was the leading? So Robert Kennedy had a huge chance of becoming president of the United States. Now, Lyndon Johnson he chose not to run and said, I will not run. Even if my party drafts me, I will not run. And so it was an open year. So, and Johnson and not Rockefeller, if you know the history, they met 2 or 3 months before Robert Kennedy was assassinated. They met in the White House, supposedly a late night meeting dinner. And among other topics, Johnson asked Rockefeller again to run as a Democrat, run as a president as a Democrat. Years later, somebody asked Nelson Rockefeller why he never got elected president. He says, well, because I was in the wrong party. Probably some truth to that. But he would not have thought, Nelson Rockefeller was a Republican to the bone, but a progressive one. But not as progressive as the Kennedy, not as progressive as JFK. So I could go on and on and on and more. So obviously 68. Now the Rockefellers couldn't let RFK in the White House after they killed JFK. Bobby would have found that truth out and sent the Rockefellers would have definitely sent him to the gallows for their guilt. So they couldn't let that happen. They had to pull all stops in and step in, and they shot him when he was a senator. He ran as Senator Robert Kennedy when he ran for the White House. He won the candidacy. He ran the Senate in New York State. I remember when Robert Kennedy, when he was campaigning for Senator in New York State, came to St. Mary's School in Auburn, New York. I wasn't 20 feet. I saw him in the flesh. And I also shook hands with Nelson Rockefeller, 1966, when he was on the stump. Of course, I didn't realize then he had shot Kennedy. You know what impressed me most about Nelson Rockefeller? How tiny he was. He was small, tiny. But that was tiny in stature, not power and wealth and greed. Okay, now let's go forward. So in 68, just to sum up, Nixon, the former vice president, won the primary, and the three front runners were Ronald Reagan, Nelson Rockefeller, and Nixon, and Nixon won the primary. Now let's go to Watergate. No, let's go to 72. Now we get into Watergate. Well, what happened in Watergate? Well, you know the story. Tell me about Watergate. Right? President Nixon resigned. Okay, well, there's more to that story than just that. Let's finish the whole story here. Nelson Rockefeller was appointed and confirmed as vice president. Ding! You see how that's add up? And he was, of course, not elected. He was appointed and confirmed by Congress and the House of Representatives. Shows you how crooked our government is. And he was confirmed. This was like, you had the big Watergate hearing in Washington, which led to a possible impeachment. I don't think Richard Nixon resigned before the impeachment vote was taken. But the Senate investigated that Watergate, and if you know anything about Watergate, you know that Standard Oil bankrolled the Watergate break-in. The burglars who were caught, like Hunt and McCord and Liddy, and then they had the Miami guys from Miami, like Frank Sturgis and a few other names there. They had these stacks of $100 bills that were coming from Standard Oil, and that per Watergate hearings. Per Watergate hearing. I'm not making this up. I say Standard Oil, but by 1962 the name was changed to Exxon, but same thing, owned by the Rockefellers. That was the company they founded. So when Nelson Rockefeller come up for his confirmation hearing, here's the grandson of the founder of Standard Oil, and Standard Oil just got accused of bankrolling the Watergate break-in. And these senators and congressmen, they wave, Mr. Rockefeller. Go right through. They asked him a couple softball questions. And Nelson Rockefeller reminded all the senators, he goes, I have 3,500 shares of Standard Oil stocks. Well, Exxon. Oh, wasn't that a reminder? Nope. That's how corrupt our government is. That's why there's been so many failed investigations out of Washington. Now they got this dog and pony show going in Washington. They're looking at these so-called declassified documents. How many documents are there, folks? How many documents you got to see to know this is... You're being lied to, okay? I'm telling you the story. All right? The Rockefellers and Kennedys, it was dynastic warfare. That's what it was about. Those documents in Washington are all typewritten documents that somebody was writing a novel. They wrote that documents up to throw everybody off the trail, the true trail. So, anyways, where was I? Well, the story's not done yet. Who appointed Nelson Rockefeller vice president? Well, President Gerald Ford, he was appointed too. He was appointed by Richard Nixon. So you got a president and vice president both appointed. Now keep in mind, when Nelson Rockefeller was plotting to kill JFK, Richard Nixon was living in his co-op on 812 Fifth Avenue, corner of 62nd Street. In the summer of 1963, when Nelson Rockefeller was plotting to kill JFK. Yeah. And don't forget, Gerald Ford was a Warren commissioner, one of the 7 ranking members who, gave the Rockefellers gave them a pass. Well, this new book I'm coming up is going to be 1,000 pages, and believe me, I got to cut stuff out. That's how big the story has grown. I'll get you all the details, a lot more details you might want to know. I'm still not done with this story yet. So here's President Ford now. He's president. He's got his vice president. How long was he? Okay, what happened out in California? Squeaky Fromm, pulled a loaded gun, 45 automatic. He only had it a few inches from President Ford's heart, and failed to pull the trigger. A loaded gun, a loaded 45. That would have ended Ford right there and then. All right. Okay. Nelson Rockefeller would have been president. Okay. Need I tell you any more? And I believe that Oswald, the accused assassin of JFK, and Sirhan, the accused assassin of Robert Kennedy, and Squeaky Fromm were all part of a massive MK Ultra program hatched by the Rockefellers to kill primarily for political assassination. And I believe, again, I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to discuss it in my book, they were after Richard Nixon. And you'll see in my book the reasons why my theory, I believe, is correct. Obviously, I believe it's correct. It is correct. They were Manchurian candidates. It was a big blacked out program, super secret program. I spent a lot of time in Montreal at the Allen Institute. Everything I learn every day just ties to the Rockefellers and MK Ultra. So there was a second attempt assassination against Gerald Ford. I'm sorry, against President Ford. This came a couple days later by an FBI informant. It was another female. And by then the Secret Service decided to do their job, and they backed the crowds up. They had the crowds backed up about 50 feet. And I'm sorry, I can't remember her name though, but she fired 2 shots at Gerald Ford and missed from across the street. She was wrestled to the ground by a former Marine. And that's it. So Nelson Rockefeller never got his dream of being called Mr. President, but he caused a lot of bloodshed. But still, he saved his family dynasty from the horrors of what the Kennedys were about to do to them. And in my book, I'm going to discuss more and more what exactly I'm talking about. And one of the primary targets of the Kennedys was Aramco, the biggest treasure trove in the nation. I'm talking here about the Saudi Peninsula. I'm sorry, not the Saudi, the Arabian Peninsula. Sometimes it's called Saudi Arabia. The Arabian Peninsula was awash with oil. The Rockefellers had the keys to that treasure trove. There's a big history there with the Rockefellers. And I go into it in my book, so you'll see a better understanding what I'm trying to tell you here. But anyways, I'm going to sum this up now. And maybe I'll just show you one more house here. Yeah. There it is. I just want to show you that. It's in Kennedy, next door neighbor to the Kennedys. It's a Wilson home. They owned, last I knew it was the Wilson home. They owned some mall stores like the Gap. And I just wanted to show you right there. You see how close it is? That was the home of Robert Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy. And, you know, there are 11 children. And I don't know anything about who lives there now or who owns it. But it's so close, it's hard to see one, or even hard to see them as two separate buildings. But that's it right there. And actually, the little part of that didn't exist in that like little bay window there didn't exist in 1963, because I've seen pictures from that date. So it was added on years later. I just wanted you to check that out. Hi folks, I'm here at Hyannis Port. This is part of my 2025 JFK assassination tour of truth. I just covered did a video at the iconic house of what they call the Kennedy compound. And I'm over here standing in front of the home of Sergeant Shriver and Eunice KennedyShriver. Now, you don't know, Eunice was the sister of President Kennedy. And she's famous for starting Special Olympics, which basically was the motivation was over her sister's challenges. Her sister was Rose Marie. I don't need to get into that, but you can Google a lot of that stuff. A lot of history written about them, her. It's a big part of Kennedy's history. And I just wanted to show you the view these people have. Just wanted to pan this camera. You know, there's so much sun out here. Miles. Well, it's a little foggy today. It's a little foggy. But miles and miles of beach and ocean here. Actually, it's not the ocean yet, but it's close. Here we're going to go back here again. All right. Now, I want to tell a story. It took place the day JFK was assassinated. It's a story that parallels the story of JFK, the assassination, but obviously it was way overshadowed. But it ties to Sergeant Shriver. That's why I tell it here. And it is a chapter in Kennedy administration history. Now, Sergeant Shriver, as you know, President Kennedy created the Peace Corps, and he appointed his brother-in-law as director of the Peace Corps. They had they were kind of the civil rights, heart of the Kennedy administration. Well, about 2 weeks before the election, the presidential election, 1963, on the advice of his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, JFK phoned Martin Luther King's wife, Coretta King, Martin Luther had Martin King, right? Martin Luther King, you know, he had got jailed for civil rights activity. And he, on the advice of Sergeant Shriver's brother-in-law, he called Coretta. It's only a 90-second call, but it's been called a phone call that changed America. And he offered her his help if she needed it. And it wasn't really more specific than that, or it was just 90 seconds. Basically, all he offered her a helping hand. And she long remembered his Massachusetts accent. Well, Robert Kennedy didn't know about it until after. And Bobby went ballistic, thinking that would blow the election. There was a lot of racism in the country. Actually, it was a few years before 1954-55, following the Brown versus Board of Education, that the Southern members in the Congress and in the Senate voted what they call the Southern Manifesto to block integration. So yeah, here was a Yankee from the North, the Kennedys, doing this. So that's what got Bobby ballistic. And understand. So, but we know Kennedy won the election. Okay. Well, there was a rift in the country. There was a rift in the Democratic Party, a huge rift that split right across the country. You had the Southern Democrats, who were primarily Protestants, who were conservatives, who were anti-union, right to work, and of course they were pro-segregationists, pro-Jim Crow. Actually, the leader of it was Senator Harry Byrd from Virginia, whose cousin, by the way, owned the TSBD. TSBD, the Texas School Book Depository. But by the way, the alleged sniper's nest. But that said, I don't want to get into all the motives behind killing JFK right here. Just read my book. I wanted to tell you the broader background history here. Well, the Northern Democrats, the Kennedy camp, were pro-union, pro-right to strike, anti-big business, anti-Rockefeller Democrats, and majority Catholic. So there was this rift. Well, the rift had widened probably because of that phone call, in my opinion. But there was a rift that remained between Governor John Connally, who was old school Democrat, South Democrat, and Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was progressive, who represented more the city of Austin and things like that. There was a rift there. And Kennedy, one of his missions when he went to Dallas was to heal that rift between Connally and Yarborough. And the day Kennedy died, his last order he gave to a Secret Service, last order he gave, period, as far as we know, was to his head of a Secret Service detail, and he told me, he says, I want Johnson to ride in the president's car, and I want Connally to ride with Ralph Yarborough. Well, here's the thing. That order never got carried out. Johnson was already at Love Field. The cars were all lined up. I'm sure Johnson countermanded that order because he was ruthless. And, you know, when Kennedy goes to step in his car, here's the governor of Texas. Well, he's not going to throw the governor of Texas out of his car. I'm sure he was preparing words to have well, he would have known it came from Johnson. So I'm sure he was preparing words for Johnson. And Yarborough Yarborough was supposed to sit with, where's Yarborough going to ride? He's got to ride with Johnson. Well, as the story goes, Yarborough did not want to ride with Johnson. He hated Johnson. So Johnson either threatened Yarborough on the spot or offered him the world to get in the car, because Yarborough did, despite his protest, Yarborough did get in with Johnson. That's a true story a lot of people don't know. So any of these people going around saying, well, the governor's supposed to ride with the president, no. Nellie Connolly said that. No, and she had no business saying that. She's way off, but to even suggest that. There's nothing in the Constitution that says the governor's got to ride with the president. It's, you do it at the president's pleasure. All right, well, anyways. Well, I mean, I like telling that story. And I'm just going to briefly, too, show you the Protestant Tower. I always like to get this in my camera. I like to get this as a part of me for shaking things a little bit here. There it is. It's not coming in so clear today. This is the Protestant Tower. To glorify the saint of golf. St. Andrews, the Protestant saint of golf. I call it the Protestant Tower. There's a golf course over to the left of us. It's the Hyannis Country Club. They actually have a little beach here. People come and swim. But here's the thing. The Kennedys, they had a lot of issues with the Protestants. In 1926, I didn't live here, and I don't know. I'm sure this was all Protestant country. This is where the Pilgrims crash landed here, a few miles north of here. I say bumped into this place. They got blown off course. And they landed here, Provincetown. So this is the Protestant world back in 26. Now the Kennedys had a history of being denied entry into country clubs. Well, all country clubs, back then they were mostly run by Protestants. They would blackball anybody they didn't want in. Literally would take a black ball and cast a black ball, literally. I know a little bit about Protestant country clubs because my Italian family used to caddy at the Protestant country club in Auburn called the Owasco Country Club. So I know a little bit about elite Protestants. But I learned this country club, the Kennedys did play there. They did play at the Hyannis Country Club. So, maybe, the barriers, the racial barriers, the ethnic barriers were kind of maybe falling down a little bit, caving in a little bit. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I always like pointing that tower out to you. All right, I think this is going to conclude my time on the ocean front here. And I hope you learned something from my narrative.